I never believed in ghosts or disappearing towns or the kind of stories that wrap themselves around your life like a noose. I liked maps because they told you where you were and where you could go, lines and coordinates and names that didn't change unless someone in an office decided to change them. I liked certainty. So when the road suggested I take a detour, I followed it the way you might follow a rumor, because sometimes rumors are the only things that feel alive in a life built on routines. It was an old county route, one of those unnamed lines that wiggled off the interstate like a forgotten vein. My GPS blinked and stuttered before surrendering to the paper map I'd picked up at the gas station because I'm the kind of person who still trusts ink when batteries die. The detour took me through a ribbon of trees that pressed close to the car like they didn't want me to go any further. I told myself it was the charm of the road, moss and stone and a smell of wet leaves, and laughed at how dramatic my own thoughts sounded. The radio played a song I hadn't heard in years and it made the whole drive feel like a movie I'd missed the start of. At the end of that dwindling lane there was a sign. Someone had sanded the letters down in a way that made the place feel older than it might be. The sign read St. Vale. Below the name, a metal placard had once held a population number. Now it was scratched away, the metal raked raw like a scalp. I parked like people park when they mean to be seen but not stayed. You know that posture, one foot on the cold pavement, one hand in your pocket, the other steering fate. I leaned on the hood and looked at the town. Everything looked too tidy for an abandoned place. The houses sat in rows with porches like frames for pictures, curtains hung in windows though not a single flame burned inside them. The post office stood with its flag half lowered, the general store's neon sign blinking open even though the windows were caked with dust. The main street ran straight and neat between the buildings, and the air had the particular hush of a town that had already practiced its silence. No dogs barked. No music leaked from radios. The only movement was a flock of sparrows that stirred and fell like paper. I told myself I'd stay 30 minutes, shoot some footage, get the sense of a place left behind. I took the camera from my bag, thumbed the on switch, and spoke into the microphone the way you learn to do when you want to sound confident for strangers watching you online. Here we are at St. Vale, I said. Looks abandoned but it's neat. Think there's a story in these streets. The camera clocked the time, it was 2:14 p.m. My voice sounded foreign in the empty square. The gas station had a paper calendar on the wall. It said October, 1987. A man's jacket hung on a peg, sun-faded and smelling like cigarettes. A coffee mug lay on the counter with a ring of dust. The radio set in the corner hummed and spat static. The door was locked but the chain had been looped in a way that suggested someone had tried to hold it closed for years. The diner's door pushed open on my touch, and for a moment the smell of grease and old pies hit me like a memory I hadn't had. There were booths, a register, a menu behind glass. The menu was handwritten, ink bled where someone had pressed too hard. On the bottom corner was a scrawl, special thanks to A. Hayes. That was my last name. Hayes. I stood in the doorway and the room spun in a way that had nothing to do with the road. Maybe it was a coincidence, I told myself, the kind of small coincidence that wiggles into your throat like a seed that will not budge. But coincidence sits differently when you're on your own in a town that doesn't have a clock. I walked the main street, camera angled low because stray shadows look better that way, because dusty glass and bent street lamps give viewers a thrill they can't find in tidy suburban lawns. When I turned the corner by the town hall, I saw a figure through the mud-dark window of the hardware store. A tall man wearing a coat that seemed older than the town. He stood facing the shelf and did not move when I approached. I lifted the camera, his face reflected as an empty mirror. I knocked and the sound made the whole building flinch. The figure moved. He stepped back from the window and the glass reflected only me for a second. Then he was gone. The map on my dash no longer made sense. Streets rearranged themselves like the film of a dream where you remember the outline but never the fingerprints. I walked and the town folded itself in halves and returned me to places I swore I had just passed. The clock in the post office was wrong, it ought to have been a steady ticking, but it showed 4 different times depending on where you stood. The bell in the church rang a time that had no relationship to any hour. I filmed everything, whispering an apology to the camera that I might be getting carried into something someone else had practiced. People ask how you notice the small things that matter. It's because small things are all you have when the large things have been smoothed away. At the tip of my tongue there was the memory of a child's handwriting, a chalk drawing that had been rubbed by boot soles. On the sidewalk a balloon lay deflated with the words, "Happy Return," printed across its face. I picked it up. My hands smelled of rubber and something sour, like an old pantry. In my mind the door to the diner simmered with a warmth I didn't know how to name. I thought of my father's laugh on the phone last week and how obvious it felt to lie to him when he asked how I was. The lie tasted like the coffee in the diner, stale, false. I found the town records in the library. Old woman at the desk with his hair like cotton. She wore a cardigan that smelled like lavender and she looked at me as though she had been expecting someone to finally break the silence. The records were bound in leather and had the tender caution of law. Old names. Births, marriages, deaths. The entries stopped in 1992 and then the space after that was blank, like an erasure in soft, practiced hands. I asked the woman, "What happened here?" She smiled without humor and said, "It got quiet." That phrase lodged in my gut like a stone and I swallowed it. I picked it up. My hands smelled of rubber and something sour, like an old pantry. In my mind the door to the diner simmered with a warmth I didn't know how to name. I thought of my father's laugh on the phone last week and how obvious it felt to lie to him when he asked how I was. The lie tasted like the coffee in the diner, stale, false. I found the town records in the library. Old woman at the desk with his hair like cotton. She wore a cardigan that smelled like lavender and she looked at me as though she had been expecting someone to finally break the silence. The records were bound in leather and had the tender caution of law. Old names. Births, marriages, deaths. The entries stopped in 1992 and then the space after that was blank, like an erasure in soft, practiced hands. I asked the woman, "What happened here?" She smiled without humor and said, "It got quiet." That phrase lodged in my gut like a stone and I swallowed it. I parked by the library and walked the alleys. There were houses with drying lines, toys with one wheel left, a child's hat on a swing spun slow in the wind. I filmed a row of mailboxes, each had a single name knocked into the rust: Holloway, Green, Miller, Hayes. The last name made my stomach drop again. Coincidences pile like dishwater and then they become a glass of drowning. I found a notebook lying in a garden. It was small, soft leather, the edges chewed by rain. My fingers opened it like a breech. The handwriting inside was rushed, the pages had the scorch of someone writing close to the mouth of a fire. Short entries, dates. Observations. They look at me with holes where faces should be. The sky is a little too close. Do not look too long at the windows. I kept the notebook in my jacket because it seemed like the right thing to do. What else did you take when you felt caught in a spider's web? The town's silence felt like arrangement, like chairs set for a meal that would never begin. I wanted to break the ritual. The notion of leaving was a small sun in my chest. I wanted to return to highways that flowed, to signs that said exit, to places with shops that closed and lights that switched off because someone didn't come home, not because an entire community had decided to dissolve. That night, I slept in the back of my car. It was safer, self-contained, honest. At 3:17 a.m., a sound woke me. 3 knocks, light but precise, at the passenger window. I sat up, the notebook heavy on my chest. The knocks came again, then silence. The town breathed like a thing that had been expecting something all day. I thought of the man in the coat who had not been there earlier but had been present in the glass. I thought of the words scraped away on the welcome sign. My hands were cold and I couldn't tell if that was from the air or the way the town sucked heat out of things to prove its point. I drove the car past the diner and the gas station and I thought of leaving. I tried to back out and the road ceased to be a road. The lane behind me shrank into a trench of trees and the tarmac dissolved under the tires like wallpaper pulled from a wall. I slowed, then stopped. Behind me the town was already rearranging itself like a maze. I was a man in a maze I had never agreed to enter. My throat felt full of sound. While the town rearranged its skeleton, I found the cemetery. If you stand in certain towns long enough you grow accustomed to the way the dead are kept, neat stones, dates, small things lying beside the headstones like tokens of someone still trying to be remembered. The graves at St. Vale were set in a thread-like pattern, some marked with dates ending nearly 100 years ago, others with names still warm with memory. A stone caught my eye, Hayes. The stone had no date but instead a sentence carved across it, "He who returns does not leave." The letters were shallow as if someone rushed to etch this last warning. I should have taken that as a sign to go. I should have put the car in reverse and drove the hell out of there. What kept me was a combination of stubbornness and something darker, the same thing that compels writers to keep typing, the pull of the thing you want to explain so much you will lose yourself in the explanation. I strode through the cemetery until I found the oldest graveyard records, and the map there had a place noted in pencil, Hollow Creek Farm, demolished in 1974. Some local story buoys the mind, and sometimes it's foolish enough to board a bus on the rumor. The farmhouse was a skeleton. Charred rafters and a place where the smoke had wiped the world. In the basement I found notebooks piled on shelves. They were bound the same way, each one containing lists of names that matched the memorial stones. Each one had dates and the final line in many of them was the same, "Went into the fog. Did not return." The handwriting tilted differently in different books as if different people had taken up the same pen, the same doom. A child had doodled pictures of houses with windows that watched people like eyes. Someone had pinned a photo of a young girl to the wall, one I recognized from some small-town paper story, Sarah Miller, missing since the autumn. The photograph had the gloss of a time before the erasure, a summer smile with a stray hair over her face. Even then I was still thinking this was an old town trouble. A bad luck, a curse. The kind people shake their heads about and then move on. The notebooks were like a catechism of fear. The last notebook on the shelf had a list of names but at the bottom of that page, in a handwriting so hurried the ink bled, were the words, "You are writing this now. He will keep his ledger." The idea that I might be in a book, and that the ink had already decided my fate, made me stagger back through the cold air like a man who had seen his own epitaph. I called my sister and the conversation was a small island of real life. I told her I was okay, that the power of small towns was charm and a bit of dust. She said she was glad I was discovering the world and I said I'd be home soon. It was a lie the size of a continent and I wrapped myself in it like an old coat because the idea of telling anyone where I really was, about the coffins without dates, about the way the wind seemed to move with an intelligence, would make me sound either insane or fantastical. When you're stuck, the mind begins to do the thing it does for survival, it seeks patterns. I wandered toward the lake at the edge of town. The lake had a mirror skin that refused my reflection. If you held still and looked long enough you realized the surface captured a version of you that did not obey the rules of light. The trees around the lake bent away like someone had softened them at the joint. On the far side a houseboat scraped at the reeds, yet there was no one aboard. Along the edge were tiny stones, not placed by a hand but by some patient creature who had an order to its choosing. I began to map the sequence in my head because for reasons I couldn't state, I needed to count. The nights in St. Vale were long and precise. They had the kind of length where your small decisions become choices made in a cathedral of time, where every move is noticed and remembered. Around midnight the town had a ritual I could once have dismissed as local custom. The lights dimmed, the shutters closed, and a sound that could be wind or an organ rose from somewhere below the ground. It threaded through the alleys. The air thickened into a porridge of possibility, and the houses pressed their faces to the street like people peering into a parade that would never arrive. On the fourth night I heard music, not a radio but something that borrowed the cadence of a music box and stretched it like taffy. It came from a house toward the center of town. I stepped closer. The windows were lit, curtained away with a soft yellow cloth so the light didn't reveal too much. A shape passed in front of the curtain. A child's silhouette. The house was immaculate, as if someone had just swept the floor, arranged the figurines on the mantel. The door was slightly ajar and I could not resist pushing it. I remember the way the floor held the echo of my shoes. The interior smelled faintly of lemon and a kind of metal like coins kept in a drawer. There were photographs on the mantel, sepia tones of faces that did not watch but that somehow possessed the look of memory. A child's tricycle lay at the foot of the stairs, the metal was polished as if an invisible hand still used it. On the wall by the stair a calendar hung. The date stopped. Not the current month, but a page torn out, the same month that had been scratched away in the town sign, October, the year the map had grayed. I felt immediately like I was trespassing in a frame that should not exist without my permission. The child shape that I'd seen behind the curtain was not a ghost in any informal sense I can explain. It was a presence shaped by the small human needs a town collects, a laugh, a cry, a certain way of walking. The presence turned toward me, and when the curtain moved the face behind it had a unanimity that broke me, it matched my own features as if seeing me summon some small homecoming. I cannot tell you the thought that passed, that perhaps this town had modeled itself after something I had not yet admitted. A person in a town is made up of 1,000 tiny commitments, names you remember, jokes you tell, the way you make coffee at certain hours. St. Vale appeared in the world like a place you could tune into, a radio station with a specific, intimate frequency. If you tuned, it would return a version of you tuned to the same sorrow that had always been there. If you stayed, the town would learn the curves of your voice and call them back to you in the night. The danger was not in the open, it was in the listening. The next morning, a note appeared on my car windshield. You can imagine fog to be kind and useless, it softens the world, erases the edges, makes everyone equal. The fog at St. Vale did not erase edges so much as fold them inward. When it arrived, it did not touch the town piece by piece. It arrived like an animal settles over its sleeping, all at once, patient and inevitable. I felt the air press on my chest like a hand. The light of my headlamp winked out as if shameful. The sound began as whispers that a man could dismiss. Then, in that great curvature where the lake met the shore, voices rose in a chorus. Not a cry of laughter or grief. But names called in the gentle way people call other people's names when they want them to return. Hayes, come here. Hayes, remember. My name sounded like a bell. It rolled across the water and threaded itself into the boards at my feet. I understood without logic that if I stepped toward them I would be welcomed with the full force of that town's memory. Instead I turned and walked. Still, as I said, walking does not stop things, sometimes it just makes you cross more bridges. I tried to go back to my car and the street had become a hallway of doors. Every door I tried opened into a room that belonged to some other life, a life that had been lived there and then folded into the town like fabric reused. One room held a table with a teapot that steamed gently though no one was near it. Another room had a television playing footage of a house I had once visited as a child. The images blurred into each other and then, oddly, into clips I recognized from my own past, my mother's house with the broken banister, the smell of her stew. The town was retrieving pieces of me and arranging them like a dressing on a stage. I went to the police station the following day though there were no policemen. The station's registry had a list of calls. My name appeared 3 times in different scrawls, each one in a different ink's hand, each handwriting trying and failing to explain. The paper beneath the glass was warm like a person's hand. It read, "He looks for the names. He collects the days." I should have believed the paper. I should have closed the book and took my life back to highways where signs are obedient. Instead I did what men do when an answer is pressed upon them, I kept looking. It was not long before the town began to answer back the way towns do when someone else has their attention. The man who'd been in the store window came to my porch at dusk and knocked in the rhythm of a heart. He did not introduce himself. He held out a small photograph, me as a child at some other town's carnival, my face smeared with cotton candy and dread. He did not speak. He left like someone finishes a sentence and does not wait for an answer. After that there were more hints than scenes. The mailbox I'd passed had a letter with an address I recognized, my childhood home. Inside were photograph strips, a family gathering where everyone looked sideways as if they had seen something at the corner of the room. Sometimes the town would draw me to places where faces I loved had walked and leave behind a token, a toy, a button, a torn piece of a familiar t-shirt. You accept tokens because they are love you can still identify. But tokens become arguments. If something takes a piece of you and then returns the smell of someone you miss, you will stretch the truth until it becomes the rope you hang from. 1 week into my St. Vale visit, a woman asked me for directions. She looked as if she had been made by the town itself, hair an exact shade of brown I imagine in old photographs, a scarf tied precisely. Her eyes were not empty, they were full with all the kind of light you'd think people carried between each other. "Have you seen my daughter?" she asked. Her voice broke into directionless pieces. I had not. She handed me a scrap of paper with a name on it, Emily. My lips formed the name before my mind caught up and I realized anyone who asked for Emily in St. Vale asked because the town had decided the asking was necessary. The days grew into a pattern. I would wake, explore, find a token, and at night the voices would murmur like a choir arranged by habit. I learned the ways of the town without wanting to. If you stand by the diner you can hear the echo of a plate dropped in a kitchen from 100 years back. If you stand at the bridge at dawn you can still hear someone cry who once stood there. It is not noise to the town but a record. I became part of a record I had hoped never to find. One night, perhaps pushed by curiosity or the foolishness of people who have always thought they could trade the dangerous for knowledge, I went into the cellar of the general store where the floorboards had been removed and the earth lauded a smell of rain. Under the floor in a small cavity, there was a ledger. The ledger was large and heavy, bound in the kind of leather that knows the touch of many hands. The columns recorded names down the left, dates across the top, the names matched those on gravestones, on the mailboxes, in the notebooks. Beside some names there were notes, took to the field at dusk, carried off by the wind, walked in fog. Beside others only blankness and, in places where someone had clearly tried and given up, no entry. At the very end, there was a page that chilled me to the marrow. In a different hand, a blue ink that had not yet faded, was a single entry with my last name. Hayes. Underneath it, a single word, return. The paper quivered as if it anticipated the future. I was supposed to leave, and yet every muscle in my body wanted to read the next line. I let myself be tempted. The week the ledger named me, the fog came earlier than usual. It rolled over the town like a sheet and the sounds dulled like a house being muffled from its outside. That night I felt the town settle around me. My phone died and the battery wouldn't charge. The radio crawled into static. The house I slept in on the edge of town seemed to breathe differently. I dreamt vividly and woke each time at 3:17 a.m. meaning to stand, to drive, to leave. Each time the knocks came at the window in the same slow, insistently human rhythm and each time I pulled the blankets over my head and pretended to be asleep because sleep feels like the only honest rebellion left. On the 10th day, I realized the ledger had new entries. Names appeared in my handwriting. I had not written them. But I knew their curve and I recognized the way my hand tilts when I sign something on the dotted line. The names were those I had read in other pages. They were the same names I'd spoken aloud in the plaza for practice, the act of vocally acknowledging a town like a test. The ink wrote and I could see the grooves where it had gone, each letter pressed into the paper as if someone had forced the pen. Under one of the names, in a script I did not use and one I recognized very painfully, were the words, told to tell. This is the point in a story where a sensible person would leave. That's the moral arc you learn, step back, assess, leave the unknown where it sits and keeps its secrets to itself. But sensible people make small lives filled with quiet things. I had long had a romance with recklessness, and I had developed a taste for the kind of questions which refuse simple answers. So when the town asked me to tell, I told. I stood at the center of its square with a camera and the notebook, and I read the names aloud like a priest intoning. They fell from my mouth as if the tongues of others had migrated into mine. People listened. I could see shapes in the shadows, and when I watched their faces in the reflection of the camera lens, their eyes held a patient hunger that tasted like expectation. With each name spoken, the air softened and something shifted in the town as if a knot had loosened. The wind moved differently. A window opened that had been closed. A bell rang in a house that had not rung in decades. Do you know the relief of finishing a task that was promised to be your undoing? It feels at once like salvation and like deep betrayal. When I finished reading, the ledger closed by itself. There was a slip of paper folded into the back cover. On it someone wrote, "Thank you for returning." My hands shook with a kind of violence I'd not known I had. The next morning, a child in a red scarf came to me and handed me a white pebble smooth as bone. She had run to the square as if the whole town had agreed to a dance and she had been the only one to know the steps. In the white pebble's smooth surface I could see, not my face, but a flicker of the diner where my mother had once hummed at the stove. My chest tightened with the ache of memory. The child smiled and ran away like someone who had been told to run before the sky noticed. I stayed longer. The reason is not noble. It was curious and cowardly at once. The town became my strange ritual. I would wake and walk and learn the edges of each small grief it kept. People who had long left with their names etched in the ledger tended to wander into the light of day sometimes. They did not stay long. They carried with them a look I have seen on sailors come home. They would sit on a bench and not speak and then disappear again when the fog slowly returned. The town offered glimpses that felt generous and small. It was addiction masked as compassion. Time is a trick in these places. What looks like weeks might be an hour, and what feels like an hour may crust into a decade. My phone's time and the town clock argued together until I ceased to trust either. I began to suspect the town was editing my life the way an editor would cut film, keeping the good scenes and splicing away the rest. The ledger told me I had been present in these splayed way before I had ever arrived. On the 20th day, something horrible and inevitable happened. I recognized the handwriting of the folded piece of paper. It was my own. The note inside said, in a few carelessly curled letters, "You can leave, but you will carry us with you." I would walk down the supermarket aisles and see the red of the child's scarf or catch the flash of the ledger's binding in a stack of old magazines. Sometimes at night I heard a distant bell as if some far-off church in that town still does ring the hours. I stopped telling friends about the town and the notebooks. People will politely offer you coffee and the kind of sadness that is used to push away strangers. They did not need small-town mysteries because their nights were full of different kinds of monsters, overdue bills, insomnia, the care of elderly parents. I stopped trying to share the weight because weight does not translate, and also because the ledger had told me something I could not unlearn. Telling grants you a share in the record and the record remembers. 3 months later there was a storm, the kind that makes the city look like a slow, sweating animal. The phone lines clicked with news about a storm and an old farmhouse burned in the hinterlands. I sat with a cup of coffee and watched the news and felt the shape of my chest tilt. The anchor spoke of a missing girl and the image on screen was a photograph I recognized from the shelves at Hollow Creek. A date flashed below her face and it was the same October that had been rubbed from the town sign. My stomach tightened, and in the ocean of my thought I understood at last the ledger's intent. This was not a town that caught fools, it was meticulous. It had worked on a calendar of people, names, and a logic that one could not easily outrun. On the anniversary of my leaving, I was at my desk when an envelope arrived with no return stamp. Inside was a small white pebble wrapped in tissue paper and a note in my handwriting that read, "You carry us." I held the stone and it felt like a beat in my palm, a small heart. I tried to throw it away. The pebble returned in odd places. On my shoe. In the pocket of a jacket I had not worn. It was as if the town had a way of holding on to anything that had held even a fraction of its memory. We are all stories after a while. Something in St. Vale taught me that stories are not merely things you tell, they are the vertebrae of a world. When people go missing, it is because they have been rewritten into a place that wants its own history to be continuous and perfect. St. Vale was tidy, calm, polite, like a person who tidies up after you and then asks you to return because they like the company. I am not saying it was conscious in the way we are conscious. Consciousness is a word with its own limits and St. Vale jumped beyond them. Maybe it had become an accumulator of memory. Maybe it used people like rooms are used for storage. Perhaps it simply could not help its appetite. I do not pretend to have an answer. What I can tell you is this: if you ever find a town that looks too neat for its age, if you notice blank dates where numbers ought to be, if you hear a music box at midnight when no child lives near, do not seek to explain. Don't stay because you think curiosity is brave. Curiosity is fine in controlled doses, like adding spice to your food. But there is a kind of curiosity that is a fever, and once it takes you it rearranges the furniture in your memory. At night, sometimes, when the city sleeps heavy, I stand by the window and listen. The street hums and, if I press my ear to the glass, I can hear the town like an old radio, names called softly in the distance, the scrape of chairs, a slow breath. It's there like a small ache that insists my attention. I think of the ledger and its thin paper and the way it must have been kept by many hands. I think of the notebook that started it and the child's pebble warm in my pocket. I think of the calendar ripped clean with the blank space where my life's date might once have been. I do not know if the town still exists in a place you can find by map. Maybe it moves like a rumor. Maybe you find it when you stop looking for something else and the silence finds you first. Am I afraid? Yes. I am afraid that stories reproduce, that the town will, like a virus, find its pattern somewhere in the world and anchor itself to another road. I am afraid that the ledger will find me again and in a handwriting shaped by loss will write my name with neat strokes. I am afraid that the next time I open my mailbox I will find a pebble and an envelope with my handwriting inside it telling me I carry them and that my leaving was only an interim. But what I fear more is the forgetting. The ledger told me in a way I could not refuse that to forget is to be eaten. There is a cruel tenderness in the way the town keeps people. It preserves them in amber, yes, but it also remembers them with an intimacy that must feel, to some, like home. For some of the missing, that must be solace. For others, like me, it is a theft. I am not sure which of us, those who vanish or those who stay with the ledger's memory, are the fortunate ones. If you think about the maps in your drawer tonight, take a moment and look at the blank spots, the gray lines that wind away from the named towns. Don't think of them as mere geography. Think, if you can, of them as places that keep collecting names like a moth collector presses specimens. Sometimes towns are like that, they keep what they like and wash the rest away. I still check my locks. I still keep my phone charged. But the pebble rests in my palm like a small, patient heartbeat and I have tried to tell this story enough times that the sound of it becomes less like warning and more like prayer. If you ever hear someone call your name in the fog and you weren't expecting them, don't answer. If something gives you a token of memory, a photograph, a pebble, a child's toy, consider that it might not be an offering but a bargain. Keep your maps close and your windows open to the wrong things occasionally. In my pockets the notebook is heavy and the ink fades but the words linger as if someone else has traced them for me. They say to listen and then they say to stop listening. I still dream sometimes of the welcome sign. I see the letters eroded and shining black under a sunlight that is too bright for ordinary use. In the dream my hand reaches out and the letters clap themselves shut. There's a bell in the background, a child's laugh, and the diary of a house that wants to keep you for its own stories. I wake up with the echo of a phrase at the back of my throat, he who returns does not leave. I am old enough now to know that some phrases are prophecy and some are promises and that the two are, in the end, the same thing. I was there, in that town, for a while. I am here, beyond it, for a while. The ledger would have me tell you this because to tell is one way of loosening the hook. But perhaps that's only help for now and not forever. I carry the pebble in my pocket, and when it cools in my palm I can almost imagine the town breathing under the soil, patient, tidy, and hungry in a way I cannot name. Keep your maps and your bearings. If you must follow a detour, bring a friend who will not be fooled by the neatness of things. If you find a town that is too neat and too quiet, do not let it teach you how to make yourself small. Do not let it teach you to fold away your calendar so that days no longer make sense. Keep your dates where they belong. Remember the names of those you love and do not let the ledger at the edge of the world make a list.